He knocked just after nightfall, when the snow was falling in slow, thoughtful flakes. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. They trembled the way memory trembles when it returns before it's ready. And when he lifted the quilt in his arms, the one my daughter sewed in her last quiet week at home, I felt the whole winter shift beneath my feet. The story begins in a remote rural town tucked between frozen fields and a river that freezes late and thaws early. Margaret, a widowed seamstress in her late 60s, lives alone in a creaking farmhouse warmed more by silence than fire. Her daughter, Lily, vanished 3 winters ago. No note, no trace, only the quilt she'd been sewing for someone she never named. Margaret keeps her days small, mending clothes, tending the stove, listening to the house breathe. But when a stranger arrives with Lily's quilt in his shaking hands, the quiet life she built begins unraveling stitch by stitch. The knock came softly, the way snow lands on an old roof, barely a sound, just a change in the air. I had drifted asleep in my chair by the stove, a quilt wrapped around my shoulders, the fire breathing low and steady behind its iron door. For a moment, I thought the knock was part of a dream. Then it came again, a quiet, uncertain tapping, as if someone wasn't sure they should be asking for a place in the warmth. I stood slowly, my knees stiff from the cold, and crossed the creaking floor. The window beside the door was fogged, but I could make out a blurred figure on the porch, tall, still, the world around him falling in white silence. When I opened the door, the wind slipped inside first, bringing snowflakes and a thin breath of night. Then he stepped forward. Snow clung to his coat like frostbitten feathers, to his hair, to the worn boots planted firmly on my porch. His hands held something pressed to his chest, a folded quilt. Not just any quilt. Her quilt. Lily's quilt. Violets stitched in wandering lines, winter stars scattered across a sky of faded blues. I knew it before I saw the pattern fully. A mother knows the work of her child's hands. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, breath rising in soft clouds, eyes downcast as if he'd walked too long in the cold and forgotten how to meet a stranger's gaze. "Come in," I said, though the words scraped out of me. It felt strange, inviting a ghost shaped like a man into my home. He stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the floor might give beneath him. Snow melted from his coat onto the boards, each drop landing with the softest tap, a kind of weary punctuation. The house changed when he entered. Not loudly, just a small shift, the way air grows still when a secret walks in. He didn't take off his coat, didn't remove his boots, didn't sit. He kept his back close to the stove, but not close enough to claim its warmth, as if afraid to take comfort he didn't think he'd earned. I watched him for a long moment, the quilt catching the flicker of firelight. Its violets glowed faintly purple in the shadows, and the stars, Lily's stars, shone in stitchwork more delicate than frost. My voice nearly failed when I finally spoke. "Where did you get that?" He didn't look at me. His gaze stayed somewhere near the floor, as if studying the grains of wood might help him remember how to speak. "She left it for you," he whispered. The words felt fragile, half-formed, as if the truth behind them was too heavy to carry on the first try. For 3 years that quilt had been missing. 3 long winters with no note, no message, no explanation, just Lily's empty room and my own silence echoing off the walls she once colored with laughter. I stepped closer, drawn by something between dread and longing. He held the quilt out slightly, but his hands trembled. Not from cold, from something older, something unfinished. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice was softer now, almost a plea. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening around a name he didn't say. "I'll tell you," he said, "but not all at once." I didn't understand. Not then. But something in his tone made the room feel smaller, the stove burn lower, the air hush itself. He still didn't sit. He stood like a man waiting for a verdict. I reached for the quilt. Only when my fingers brushed the edge of the fabric did he finally let go, as if handing it over cost him something measured in years, not moments. The cloth was cold. Stiff in some places, as though it had been damp and dried again. I unfolded it slowly, my hands remembering the same pattern Lily traced the night she finished it, one violet for every day she promised me she'd stay. The warmth of the stove began to soften the quilt, and for a moment, I almost felt her hands in mine again. He watched, his jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to the door every few seconds as if he expected someone else to arrive. Finally, when I couldn't bear the weight of silence anymore, I asked, "When did she give this to you?" The stranger took a long breath. 3 winters ago, he said. The night she left. My heart stilled. Everything in the room, the flame, the wind, even the ticking of the old clock, drifted into one long pause. He raised his eyes for the first time, and whatever he carried there was heavier than sorrow. She said you'd understand, when the time was right. But I didn't understand. Not even a little. Only confusion rose in my chest, sharp, thick, flooding the space behind my ribs. Why now? I managed. If she left this for me, then why bring it to me after all this time? His gaze flickered, not away this time, but deeper inward, as though he was watching a memory unfold just past my shoulder. Because she said I'd know, he murmured. When the first snow fell on the violets. I looked down at the quilt. The violet embroidery, once bright, seemed darker now, as if touched by winter itself. The first snowstorm had begun only hours earlier. Soft, quiet, catching on every corner of the world. He seemed to read the realization on my face. She knew you'd be alone tonight. I felt the words settle in the room like dust. Had Lily known my loneliness that well? Had she predicted the exact night he'd come? The stranger stepped back toward the door, his boots leaving tiny puddles of melted snow. I have to go, he said. His voice tightened, as if the next part of the story was too heavy to stay in the warmth with. But I'll return at dawn. There's more you need to know. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Is she... I couldn't finish. He lowered his eyes. His silence told more truth than any answer could have. He touched the doorframe gently, like someone saying goodbye to a house they once knew. Then he whispered one last thing, a tremor in every syllable. She didn't leave to run away. The latch clicked softly as he stepped into the snow. The wind carried him into the dark, and the porch light flickered behind him, as if unsure whether to stay lit. I stood in the doorway, holding the quilt Lily stitched in the last days she spent under my roof. Snow fell quietly over the yard, softening every edge of the world. Inside, the stove crackled once, like a faint reminder that some things still lived here. I closed the door slowly, the quilt heavy in my arms, a weight made not of fabric, but of years. When I set it across the table, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a single loose thread near the corner, pulled out just slightly, as if someone had tucked something inside. I ran my thumb along the seam. The thread resisted, then loosened. A folded slip of paper slipped out and fell silently onto the table. My breath caught. The ink was faded, but one word was clear: wait. The room felt suddenly colder, as if winter itself had stepped through the door he'd closed behind him. What was I waiting for? And why had Lily trusted a stranger to deliver her final message? The quilt lay open under the lamplight, its violets dark, its winter stars trembling faintly in the warmth. And somewhere outside, beyond the fields and frozen creek, I imagined his footprints disappearing into the snow, leading back to the place where her story didn't end, just paused. The first chapter of her return had finally begun. The house was still when dawn finally arrived, the kind of stillness that feels older than the walls themselves. A pale blue light seeped through the frosted windows, catching on every corner of the room, turning the dust into little floating stars. The stove had burned low, its last embers barely glowing under a layer of gray ash. I hadn't slept. I'd stayed at the table all night, the quilt laid out before me like a map to a place I wasn't sure I was ready to revisit. My hands rested on it for a long time, palms flat against the fabric, as if I could warm it back into the shape of the girl who once stitched it. Lily's fingers had danced over this cloth. Mine trembled. The light brightened slowly, spreading across the table until it reached the violets first. Their colors had faded, the purple dulled, the green soft, the blues washed into almost nothing. Years had a way of lightening the things you wish would stay dark and darkening the things you needed clear. I traced each violet, one by one, my fingertips following the gentle pull of thread. She had sewn them with the patience of someone hoping the world would slow down just long enough for her to belong to it. But as I reached the lower corner, the stitches changed. They were tighter, smaller, drawn close together in a way that didn't match the rest. Like she'd been sewing in a hurry, or hiding something as she worked. A small knot caught beneath my nail. I leaned in, my breath fogging slightly in the cold air. She never tied knots like that. She always said knots meant fear, and fear didn't belong in things meant to keep you warm. The edge of the seam bulged just slightly, as if something thin rested inside the fold. I slid my finger under the loose thread and pulled gently. It resisted at first, then gave way with a soft snap that sounded far too loud in the quiet kitchen. From inside the seam, a strip of paper slipped out and landed silently on the table. My heart stumbled. The quilt's colors blurred. Even the air seemed to shift around me. The paper was narrow, creased sharply as though it had been folded and refolded many times. The ink had bled in places, making the lines look like they'd been watered down by tears or snow or both. But one single word, remained clear. River. It sat there on the table like a confession too small to carry the weight behind it. I reached out and touched the strip, my fingertip brushing the smeared corner. The paper was stiff, as though it had weathered wind or dampness before finding its way here. How long had it been hidden there? How many winters had passed with this message sewn against Lily's careful violets? The floor creaked behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The stranger was standing near the doorway, the morning light catching the edges of his coat and the tired slope of his shoulders. I didn't hear him enter. I didn't hear the door open. For all I knew, he'd been there a long while, watching in the quiet way someone watches a memory they have no right to touch. He didn't speak, just studied the quilt from afar, as though the fabric carried something fragile, a truth he was afraid I might break open. His gaze flicked to the strip of paper. His expression didn't change, but his breath did, a small, uneven shift in his chest as if he'd been holding the air too long. "You found it," he said softly. My fingers tightened around the paper. "Did you know it was there?" He hesitated before nodding just once. Anger wasn't what came next. Just questions. A quiet flood of them. Too many to speak. Too many to hold back. I lifted the paper so he could see the word. Which river? What was she trying to say? His eyes lowered, as if the answer lived somewhere near the floorboards. "She wrote it the night she left," he murmured. "She said if you ever found it, you'd understand where to look." "But I don't," I said. My voice cracked in the cold air. "I don't understand any of this." He stepped closer, just enough that the light touched the tired lines beneath his eyes. He still didn't meet my gaze. "She trusted the river," he said quietly. "She said it remembers what people forget." His words felt too big, too strange, too full of shadows. "What river?" I repeated, because truth should never have to be guessed. "Tell me." He finally looked at me, and the fatigue in his eyes was the kind that didn't come from sleepless nights but from carrying something too heavy for too long. "There's only one river she meant," he said. "The one where roads end, and where everything started for her." A chill moved across the kitchen, the kind that doesn't come from the cold but from recognition. I knew the river he meant. Everyone in this valley did. The old crossing near the abandoned shed, where the water ran slower than memory and deeper than truth. "Why didn't she come home?" I asked, though I already knew this question was too large for this moment. His jaw tightened. "She wanted to. But wanting and returning aren't the same." Silence settled again, heavy and fragile. He reached into his coat and took out a worn leather glove, hers. The one she lost years ago near that very river. I stared at it, my heart aching in a way I hadn't felt since the morning she disappeared. "She dropped this before she crossed," he said. "She said it was something you'd know how to follow." I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. Only a thin breath, as soft as the dawn itself. The light from the window shifted, casting a pale glow over the quilt. The violets looked different now, not faded, but muted, as if waiting for something. The word river lay between us. Small, smudged, certain. He stepped backward toward the door, his limp more pronounced in the morning cold. "When the sun rises higher," he said softly, "I'll take you there." "To the river?" "To where she left the rest." The room felt too quiet after he left, the kind of quiet that presses on your ribs and makes old griefs start breathing again. I picked up the quilt and held it close, burying my face against the violets she stitched with hopeful hands. Snow continued falling outside, soft as ash, soft as secrets. And somewhere beyond the fields, the river waited, carrying whatever pieces of Lily it had held for 3 long winters. The storm deepened as the morning wore on, snow falling in thick, tired sheets across the fields. The wind pressed itself against the house, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window and sighing through the roof beams like an old memory trying to get in. I set the kettle on the stove, though I wasn't sure either of us wanted tea. The stranger, Daniel, he had said, stood near the wall, not leaning exactly, but holding himself stiffly as if the house might fold inward if he let his weight rest on anything. He hadn't removed his coat, or his boots, or the expression that made him look as though he were standing inside a confession he hadn't meant to make. The quilt lay between us on the table, a kind of quiet witness. He kept glancing toward the door, like someone waiting for a late companion or fearing an unwanted one. Finally, I pulled out a chair and motioned toward it. "You can sit, you know," I said. He didn't. His shoulders dipped slightly, but he stayed where he was, hands tucked inside the fraying sleeves of his coat. "I won't be long," he murmured. His voice had a grain to it, like wood rubbed too many times by a tired hand. Outside, the storm hit the siding hard, the kind of storm that makes the world feel farther away than it should be. I took my seat instead. "You said her name last night," I began softly. "Lily." He closed his eyes briefly, as though the name itself stirred something he wasn't ready to let surface. When he opened them again, they looked older. And quieter. "Yes," he said. "I met her." "Where?" He hesitated, a long, thin silence stretching between us like a thread pulled too tight. "In a place," he said finally, "where roads end and water begins." I waited, but he offered nothing more. His gaze drifted toward the window, tracking the snow as if it carried the next part of the story. "That could be anywhere," I said gently. "It doesn't tell me who you are." "My name is Daniel," he repeated, as though the name itself was all the truth he could afford to give. His limp was more noticeable now as he shifted his weight from one leg to the other. A small wince flickered through him, gone almost too fast to see. But I saw it. And I saw the way he tried to hide it, the way men hide old injuries when the pain is not in the body but in the memory of who they once were. I folded the corner of the quilt back, tracing Lily's violet embroidery with my thumb. "Why did she give this to you?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly toward the door again, as if listening for footsteps that weren't there. The kettle began to hum, a soft, low note that filled the room like a second heartbeat. His shoulders tightened. The grief in him sat heavy, visible even in the way he breathed. "Daniel," I tried again. What is it you're afraid of? He flinched, an involuntary twitch of someone who's kept secrets too long and finds them suddenly fragile in daylight. I'm not afraid, he said. But his eyes flickered toward the door for the fourth time in a minute. You act like someone might follow you. He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, just lowered his gaze to the floor. I act, he said slowly, like someone who knows what's lost when the wrong person arrives first. The words chilled the room more than the winter ever could. I poured the tea, my hands steady though my chest wasn't. The steam curled upward in thin strands that reminded me of the way Lily used to braid her hair before school, carefully, precisely, as if every strand meant something. He watched the steam too, eyes drifting in and out of memory. How did you meet her? I asked softly. He lifted his hand and pressed his thumb into the palm, a nervous gesture that didn't match his calm voice. She came to the river, he said. Same as I did. But she wasn't lost. Not like me. He paused, as though the next words needed permission to be spoken. She helped me, he added, in ways I didn't deserve. The storm tightened around the house, snow hitting the glass in sharp, uneven bursts, like tapping fingers. Why didn't she come home? I asked. The question felt fragile, like a wing pressed between 2 pages of a book. I asked her that too, he murmured. Many times. His throat moved, as if the answer had teeth. But she'd only say one thing. Some homes don't stay the same. The kettle clicked off, leaving us in a silence that seemed suddenly deeper than before. He took one slow breath. Then another. I watched him battle something inside himself, some truth clawing to the surface that he wasn't ready to let breathe. He looked at the quilt, at the violets, at the stitching he must have memorized in some long, quiet hour before bringing it to me. She talked about you, he said finally. More than anything, more than the river, more than the rest. My heart thudded once, hard enough that the room seemed to shift. What did she say? He shook his head. Not enough. Not the part you need. He stepped away from the wall, favoring his injured leg. The limp was more pronounced now, like the truth was pulling on it. There's more, he said harshly. But it isn't time. When will it be? When the storm lets up, he whispered. When the river tells you what it kept. The river again. Always the river. He adjusted his coat, the fabric brushing against itself with a sound like brittle leaves. I shouldn't have come so early, he murmured. But I couldn't wait any more. Wait for what? He lifted his eyes, and they were full of something raw, a mix of guilt and devotion and a truth he feared would unmake us both. For her, he whispered. For Lily. He turned toward the door, but stopped before opening it. You asked what ties me to her, he said, his voice nearly breaking. I think you already know. His hand touched the doorknob. The storm roared on the other side. But if you don't, he paused, breathed in, breathed out. The river will show you. Then he stepped outside, disappearing into the storm as quietly as he'd first arrived. I stood at the door long after he left, watching the snow erase his footprints one by one until the world looked untouched again. The kettle rasped behind me, cooling slowly. The quilt lay on the table, the word river still resting beside it like a question too patient to answer itself. The storm had swallowed everything else, sound, sight, certainty. But in that white silence, one truth settled deep in my bones. Whatever tied Daniel to Lily wasn't finished. And whatever brought him to my door would return when the river was ready. The morning arrived without color. Just a thin, gray light slipping through the curtains, the kind that makes a house feel older than it is. I woke to silence, the kettle cold, the storm softened into a hush, and an emptiness in the corner where Daniel had stood. His absence felt deliberate, as though he had folded himself back into the snow before the daylight could ask him questions. But the door. I saw the door first. It hung slightly open, a thin draft sliding across the floorboards like a memory returning through the cracks. And then the footprints, leading away from the porch toward the line of bare trees that marked the path to the river. I hadn't meant to follow them. But some stories don't wait for permission. They simply keep going, and all you can do is walk after them. The quilt was still here, draped over the chair closest to the fire, gently, carefully, as though Lily herself had set it down just moments ago. I touched the corner, feeling the softness of worn cotton, the faint scent of lavender still caught in the seams. Something in my chest tightened. She always folded it that way. Always draped it with its violets facing outward, so the room remembers spring, she used to say. The house was warm where she once stood. Still. Waiting. I slipped my coat on and stepped outside into the morning air. It wasn't as cold as the night before, but the kind of cold that carried warnings in its breath, warnings about thin ice, and truths buried beneath it. Daniel's footprints were easy to follow, each one pressed deep into the softened snow, the imprint uneven where his injured leg faltered. But there was something else. The pattern was strange, like he had stopped often, turned back once, hesitated many times. The trail moved toward the woods and then straight down the narrow path to the riverbank, a place where roads ended and water began. His words echoed, quiet as a whisper caught between trees. I reached the river sooner than I expected. The wind moved through the reeds with a long, tired sigh. Brittle stalks leaned over the frozen water, their shadows thin and trembling. Something in the snow caught my eye, a patch of flattened reeds where someone had stepped heavily. Several times. Recently. I crouched down, my fingers brushing the broken stems. Then I saw it, caught on a low branch as if placed there gently, a single purple thread. I pinched it between my fingers, holding it up to the light. The color was unmistakable, a shade Lily always used when she stitched violets into her quilts. The wind picked up slightly, and the ice along the river groaned, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to rise from beneath the surface. Not water, not movement, just the river shifting under its own weight, restless, uneasy. I backed away slowly, the sound marking each step in my spine. That's when I noticed the second set of footprints. They weren't Daniel's. His had the uneven drag of a man familiar with pain. These were smaller, lighter, steadier, and older, much older, the edges softened by snow that had fallen long before last night. I turned, my breath visible in the cold air. They ran parallel to Daniel's for a few yards, then dipped closer to the river, stopping right at the edge where the reeds were bent. Two people had stood here. One last night. One long ago. The ice groaned again. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, though the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. Memories began to rise, slow and uncertain. Lily standing at this riverbank on the day she turned 18, her hair tied in a violet ribbon. She had said she wanted to hear what the river keeps. I never understood that. Not then. Not even now. But as I stared at the two sets of footprints, one fading, one fresh, I felt the past pulling like a tide beneath the ice. I followed Daniel's prints to the water's edge, my boots slipping slightly on frozen mud. The snow around me was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a person listen too hard to their own heartbeat. I traced the second set of footprints again, my eyes following the faded path back toward the woods. A path Lily could have taken. A path she once took. A path she might have returned to without coming home. I looked at the purple thread in my hand and felt the old ache settle behind my ribs. Lily! Her name moved through me like a breath I had held too long. A faint crack echoed across the river, sharp and quick. The ice shifting again. Only this time it didn't sound like nature. It sounded like a warning. I stepped back instinctively, my boots crunching in the snow. When I turned, my heart caught in my throat. The second set of footprints, the older ones, had another detail I hadn't noticed at first. Some of them overlapped Daniel's, as though someone else had walked beside him in the dark just hours ago. Or years ago. The lines blurred, time folding itself in strange places. I closed my eyes, trying to steady the tremor in my chest. "Did you walk with someone?" I whispered into the cold air. The wind didn't answer. But something else did, a faint, almost imagined sound carried by the shifting ice. A hum. A soft hum. Like someone stitching quietly in another room. Lily used to hum that way when she worked. A tune without words. A comfort without reason. It stopped as quickly as it came. But I felt it. The way one feels a hand rest briefly on their shoulder before realizing no one is there. I turned back toward the house, one hand on the purple thread, the other tracing the worn seam of my coat. Daniel's footprints pointed homeward. But mine felt heavier, as though I carried the weight of two people. The second set of footprints remained by the river, quiet and untouched, waiting for someone to remember their story. As I walked away, the wind shifted, carrying a sound I couldn't name, half whistle, half whisper, like the beginning of a voice learning to speak again. I didn't look back. Not yet. But with each step, I knew the truth. Lily's goodbye was not finished. And neither was the river. The frost had worked its way into everything by the time I reached the river again, the boards of the bridge, the rails, even the old warning sign with its faded red letters. A thin layer of ice clung to the world like a memory that refused to melt. The sun hadn't broken through the clouds yet, and the light that did reach the river looked pale, almost silver. The bridge creaked the moment I stepped onto it. A long, aching sound, as though the boards remembered every footstep they had ever carried. Mine, Lily's, and now Daniel's. I paused halfway, my breath floating in the cold air, listening to the soft groan beneath me. Winter has a way of turning simple crossings into quiet journeys of their own. The river below was a sheet of white glass, still but not silent. Every now and then, a crack whispered somewhere under the surface, faint and unsettling, like the breaking of a promise no one witnessed. I pulled my coat tighter and kept walking. On the other side of the river, the trees grew close together, their bare branches woven like old fingers knotted in prayer. I knew this path well. Too well. When Lily was small, she'd run ahead on this trail with her ribboned hair bouncing and her tiny boots kicking up dust. And at the end of it, the shed. An old, abandoned thing slouching beneath the pines, its roof sagging like it carried the weight of too many seasons. The door hung crooked, open just enough for the wind to hum through the gap. The sound reminded me of Lily humming to herself while she stitched, lost in her own gentle world. I pushed the door open with my gloved hand. It swung inward reluctantly, as if disturbed after years of keeping its own secrets. Inside, the cold held the air still. Dust floated in thin strands of light coming through a cracked board. The floor smelled of damp earth and old wood. Then I saw them, the dried flowers, pressed carefully along the wall, their stems tied with bits of twine and strips of colored thread. And beneath them, small scraps of fabric, stitched together in the beginnings of what looked like tiny quilt squares. My heart lurched. The patterns were familiar. Lily always sewed stars when she felt lonely. And there, on a small wooden box near the corner, sat a single carving. A star. Her star. The one she used to draw in the margins of every notebook, the one she carved into the barn door when she was 12, the one she stitched on every quilt meant for someone she loved. I touched it. The wood was smooth where her hands had sanded it down, careful and patient. My throat tightened. It felt like touching her hand again, a memory I wasn't ready for. A branch snapped behind me. Soft. Deliberate. I turned, my breath catching. Daniel stood just outside the doorway, half shadowed by the trees. His coat was dusted with snow, his limp more pronounced than before. He wasn't approaching, just watching, as though guarding something fragile in the shed. His eyes followed my hand as it hovered over the carved star. There was something raw in his expression, something grief-shaped. "She stayed here," he said quietly. "Longer than you think." His voice held no triumph, just sorrow and truth. I stepped toward the doorway, my boots brushing against dried leaves. "How long?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced around, as though the walls themselves might object to him speaking. "She stayed here," he repeated, "for more than a season." The words landed heavily, like frost settling on glass. "A season," I echoed. "That could mean months." His gaze drifted downward, to the old floorboards where faint footprints still lingered in the dust. "Longer," he murmured. "Too long." I felt something buckle inside me, a quiet collapse. She had been so close, so impossibly close, just across the river, within walking distance of home. Yet she never came back. My voice trembled despite myself. Why? Why would she stay here and not come to me? Daniel's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the effort of holding something in. "She had her reasons," he said softly. "Reasons she thought would keep you safe." Safe. The word scraped against something raw in me. "From what?" I whispered. He exhaled slowly, his breath a small cloud in the cold air. "From the truth," he said. "The one you weren't meant to carry alone." He stepped inside the shed then, his limp dragging across the threshold. The floor creaked in recognition, as if it remembered him. "I tried to convince her," he said, moving closer to the dried flowers. "Told her you had a right to know. Told her secrets don't keep people safe, they only keep them apart." He brushed a fingertip over one of the wilted stems. "But she wouldn't listen," he whispered. "She was so much like you." The cold seemed to deepen around us, settling in the corners of the shed. I turned toward the carved star again, my hand trembling over it. "She made this," I said. "Here. Alone." Daniel nodded. "Not alone," he murmured. "Not at first." I swallowed hard. "Then with who?" His eyes flicked upward, full of the same haunted quiet I'd seen the night he brought the quilt. "That's the part she didn't want you to know," he said. "The part she thought would break you." The wind hissed through the cracked board, pushing a strand of dust across the floor like a trail pointing home. I stepped toward him. "Daniel, tell me." He closed his eyes briefly, breathing through whatever truth pressed against his ribs. But when he opened them again, he only said one thing. "She wasn't hiding from you. She was hiding for you." The boards above us creaked softly, as if agreeing. Or warning. I stepped back outside, the cold hitting my face with a sharper edge than before. The river waited beyond the trees, its surface shining faintly under the pale winter sky. Lily had been here. 4 months. 4 seasons. Leaving pieces of herself in dried flowers, in scraps of fabric, in carved stars, breadcrumbs of a goodbye I still didn't understand. Daniel stood at the doorway, the shed framing him like a memory caught between years. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes held something, not warning, not fear, but inevitability. As though he knew this was only the beginning of what the river still had to say. I turned back toward the bridge, the frost cracking gently under my boots. The wind carried a faint hum, soft and familiar, like someone stitching on the other side of winter. I didn't look back at the shed. Not yet. But I felt it behind me, full of Lily's quiet messages, waiting for the moment I'd be ready to hear them. And somewhere inside that cold silence, I knew the next step would take me deeper into the truth she left behind. I hadn't even shut the door behind us when Daniel placed something in my hands. Not with ceremony, not with hesitation, just a quiet surrender, like he'd carried the weight of it for far too long. A bundle of envelopes, tied together with a thin ribbon the color of late winter sky. Edges frayed, paper softened by time and someone's careful handling. My name was on every one, written in Lily's handwriting, the same looping curves she used on grocery lists and birthday cards before the world became heavier than her pen could hold. My knees weakened. I sat without remembering how, the weight of the bundle settling like a heartbeat in my lap. Outside, the wind brushed the house in soft, restless strokes, as though urging me to open what I had been denied for years. The first envelope tore too easily, paper peeling like old skin. Inside, just a few lines, barely more than breaths pressed into ink. Mama, if I could stay, I would. But winter has its own truth, and I can't let it reach you. The words blurred before my eyes reached the end. I blinked hard and opened another. This one longer, the edges wrinkled from damp fingers. You always said the river speaks if you listen right. It told me something I wish I could forget. I didn't mean to find it. I didn't mean to follow it this far. The wind rattled the window then, as if interrupting. Or agreeing. I felt Daniel watching me, not intruding, not shifting, just standing with the sort of stillness only guilt can teach a person. Another envelope. Another letter. I'm safe, Mama. I promise. But I'm close enough to see home and far enough to keep you from harm. Don't come looking. Please. Not yet. My breath caught on the last word. Yet. She had believed there would be a later. A return. A moment she could come back without shadowing me with whatever truth she carried. I pressed the letter to my chest, closing my eyes against the sting behind them. Daniel cleared his throat softly. Lily wrote them, he said, but she couldn't send them. His voice was a rough whisper, the kind of sound a man makes when he's learned to speak only the parts that won't break him. Why bring them to me now? My voice felt paper-thin. Because you're already in it, he said. You stepped in the moment you followed my footprints. I looked up sharply. He didn't flinch. She didn't want you caught in it, he added. But the truth doesn't care who wants to be spared. There was something else in his eyes, a fear darker than winter, older than guilt. I opened another letter. And another. And another. Each one shorter than the last, as though her strength, or her time, had begun to run thin. One read, I know now whose footsteps were in the snow. But it's not my secret to tell. I'm staying where I can watch, where I can warn someone if it comes back. My fingers trembled around the paper. Warn who? I whispered. Warn me. Daniel shifted his weight, his limp pulling at him like a memory he couldn't walk away from. She was protecting someone, he said. And she thought you'd be the one most hurt if the truth broke loose. What truth? The words felt scraped raw. He looked away. At the river, he said. Something happened. Before she wrote the first letter. Something she didn't understand until it was too late. My pulse thudded in my ears, a slow, heavy drumbeat echoing the cadence of the storm outside. The next letter was smudged from water, whether tears or snow, I couldn't tell. Daniel says I shouldn't be afraid, but he doesn't know what I saw in the ice. What I heard there. Mama! I think winter keeps its own secrets, and one of them followed me. A shiver crawled up my spine. I hadn't realized Daniel had moved closer until I felt the warmth of his shadow fall across my shoulder. She wasn't imagining things, he murmured. There are things people keep buried for years, decades. He paused. His voice lowered until it nearly disappeared. And some things the river won't stay quiet about. I pressed the letters together in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. What danger was she afraid of? Daniel closed his eyes as though the question carried weight enough to bend him. The kind, he said slowly, that doesn't knock on doors. The kind that waits. And watches. And hopes you won't look too closely. His words hung in the air, heavy and cold, as the storm outside strengthened again, snow brushing the windows like fingertips searching for entry. I opened the last envelope. It was the smallest of the stack, the flap barely sealed. Inside was only one line: "If I don't come home by spring, follow the violet thread." A single thread fell into my hand, purple, soft, the same shade caught on the branch by the riverbank. I stared at it until my vision blurred. The room swayed in a quiet, aching way, as if the letters had shifted the weight of the world onto my shoulders. Daniel touched the back of the chair. "Not me, not yet. Just the wood," as though asking permission to speak again. "She thought she could handle it alone," he said. "She thought staying away meant you'd be safe." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "She didn't run from you, Margaret." A long pause. "She ran toward something." The fire crackled behind us, filling the silence with tiny fractures of sound. I gathered the letters into my arms, feeling their weight, small but unbearably heavy. The thread lay across my palm like a path I wasn't ready to follow but could no longer ignore. Outside, the wind had quieted, the storm pausing as though listening. Daniel stepped toward the door, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "It's time," he said softly, "to stop reading her fears and start following her steps." He opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air and a swirl of white flakes that settled gently onto the floor. I stayed seated, the letters in my hands, the thread across my palm, and one truth echoing through me: whatever danger Lily faced was not gone. And whatever secret she tried to protect me from was still waiting in the winter she never left behind. The house felt different when I stepped back inside, as if the walls themselves had been listening to the storm of things I'd learned and didn't quite know what to do with them. Snow slid off the roof in soft, heavy sheets, the sound low enough to blend with the crackle of the stove and the hush of my own uneven breathing. I hung my coat by the door and crossed the room slowly, each floorboard giving a faint creak, the kind that makes you wonder how much of a home's memory is held in its wood. The quilt lay where I'd left it, draped over the chair, violets facing outward, as if waiting for my hands the way Lily once waited at the kitchen table for me to notice her new patterns. I sat down and pulled the quilt across my lap. The fabric was warm from the fire, soft from years of handling. My fingers moved over the stitches out of habit before my mind could catch up. And then the stars began to speak. The constellation Lily designed swept across the center of the quilt, a trail of delicate, silver thread stars, each one unique, each one placed with intention. I traced them slowly, feeling the small ridges beneath my fingertips. She'd chosen the pattern on a night thick with summer heat, lamplight glowing golden on her skin as she hummed a tune her father used to carry around the house. It had been years since I'd allowed myself to remember that sound. But now, sitting by the stove with her quilt on my knees, I could hear it as clear as if she were humming in the next room. She had sewn long into the night, bare feet curled beneath her, hair falling across her shoulder in loose waves she never bothered to tie back. I remembered the rhythm of her needle, the soft puncture of fabric, the tug of thread, the pause when she looked at me to see if I was watching. "I'm stitching something that'll last longer than winter," she had said. "Something that looks like hope in the dark." At the time, I thought she was simply in one of her dreamy moods. But now, with the letters in my pocket and the purple thread still on the table, her words felt heavier, truer, like a warning whispered years before its time. My thumb caught on something, a small bump beneath the constellation's center star. A knot? A fold? No. Something tucked inside. I lifted the patch gently, pressing the fabric until the seam loosened. The stitching here was different. Tighter, smaller, almost hurried. My heart slowed, then stumbled. This wasn't just decoration. I slipped a fingernail under the edge and tugged gently until the corner of paper surfaced, thin, brittle, tucked so carefully it could have gone unnoticed forever if the light hadn't caught it just right. The note slid into my hand like a fallen leaf. Ink faded, edges soft with age. I unfolded it carefully, my breath trapped somewhere between my ribs. Only one line remained legible. If he comes before dawn, don't be afraid. I read it twice. A third time. The words blurred, but not from the ink. He. The note wasn't about Daniel. I knew that instantly, with a certainty that broke something in me. Lily had expected someone else. Someone she believed might arrive in the dark hours before daylight could soften his presence. My pulse tapped at my throat. Who had she been waiting for? And what kind of arrival needed a warning not to be afraid? I placed the note on the table, the faded ink trembling slightly in the glow of the stove. The house seemed to listen, holding itself still as though the answer might be hiding inside its silence. Daniel's absence felt heavier now, not just a man gone into the cold, but a missing piece in a story I wasn't sure I wanted completed. I picked up the quilt again, searching for other hidden seams, other hurried stitches. There were more, small places where the thread tightened as if her hand had trembled while sewing secrets into fabric. How many messages had she left before she disappeared into winter? How many truths had she tried to hide in the only language she trusted, needle, thread, and faint constellations meant to guide someone home? The fire shifted, a log settling with a soft thump. The sound reminded me of another night, the last night she stayed under this roof. She'd paced the living room, wringing her hands, glancing toward the door as though expecting someone. When I asked who she was looking for, she just said, "It's nothing." But her voice had cracked on the last word. Nothing had never sounded so much like fear. Snow tapped at the window, a slow, uneven rhythm, like someone thinking instead of knocking. I held the faded note close, trying to imagine who Lily feared might come before dawn. Someone she knew. Someone she expected. Someone she wrote about only in shadows and half-phrases like winter truth and the footsteps in the snow. I could almost hear her voice, soft, strained, sewing late into the night, humming to steady her hands. She hadn't been hiding from Daniel. He had already said that. So who? The fire dimmed slightly. The house breathed out a long, quiet sigh. There are moments when a truth doesn't arrive in words or sounds, just a shift in the air, like something unseen leaning closer. And in that moment I felt it. A presence. Not inside the house. Not outside either. More like a memory stirring from where I'd buried it, a voice I had tried to forget, a name I hadn't spoken since the winter Lily left. A cold realization seeped through me. Whoever Lily expected was someone from our past. Someone who had left a shadow long before she disappeared. I folded the quilt slowly, the note tucked in my palm, my breath sharp and uneven. I rose from the chair and moved to the window. The snow had eased, but the sky had not brightened, a pale, muted gray hovering between night and morning. Footprints trailed from my porch toward the river path again, Daniel's, fading. But beside them, barely visible now, ran another trail. Older. Lighter. As if someone had walked that path long before last night, and might walk it again before dawn. I felt the hairs on my arms lift beneath the quilt's weight. Lily had known something. Someone. And if they were still out there, winter wasn't finished with me yet. By late afternoon, the snow had thinned into a soft whisper across the field, falling so lightly it looked like dust shaken from an old book. The light outside dimmed early, that strange winter half-light that feels neither day nor night, just a long-held breath. I sat by the window, the quilt folded across my lap, Lily's hidden note tucked safely in my pocket. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every sound your own body makes, your breath, your heartbeat, the soft shift of fabric as you move. Then I felt it. Before I saw anything at all, a presence, as soft as a change in the air pressure, as unmistakable as a shadow stepping into a room you thought was empty. I looked up, and there, standing at the far edge of the field, was a man. His figure was long and still, as though carved from the tree line behind him. A dark coat hung from his shoulders, brushing the tops of his boots, and though the wind swept across the open field, he didn't move. Just watched. The house. Me. I leaned closer to the window. The glass fogged beneath my breath, so I wiped it clean with my sleeve just to be sure I was truly seeing what I thought I saw. He stood about 30 yards out, far enough to blur details, but close enough that I could see one thing clearly. When he breathed, there was no fog. Not a wisp. Not a cloud. Nothing. The cold should have caught his breath, held it like a small white ghost right in front of his face. But there was only stillness. I rose slowly, my knees stiff from sitting. The boards under my feet gave a small, uneasy creak as I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The air bit at my skin, sharp and clean, but he didn't move at all. Didn't react, didn't turn. Just watched. Hello. My voice felt too loud against the quiet field, but it carried. I saw the faint tilt of his head as though acknowledging sound, but he didn't answer. I took one step down the porch, then another. That's when he moved, not forward, but back. A retreat. Slow, steady, like someone yielding a boundary he himself had drawn. He kept his eyes on me as he stepped away, as though making sure I didn't follow. And when he turned toward the line of trees, something fell from his hand, a small, fluttering strip that the wind carried only a foot or two before letting it rest in the snow. I didn't chase him. Instinct whispered don't. And instinct has its own kind of truth in winter. Instead, I waited until he vanished behind the pines before I crossed the yard to where the cloth lay. I knew it before I picked it up. The color. The texture. The faint scent of lavender caught between threads. It was a strip of Lily's quilt binding. My heart thudded once, twice, the sound thick enough to drown out the wind. Someone else had touched her quilt, handled it, cut from it, or carried a piece she had sewn intentionally to be recognized. The strip trembled slightly between my gloved fingers as I turned it in the fading light. It was identical, not similar, not close, identical to Lily's stitching. Snow began to fall harder, flakes landing on the cloth, melting instantly, like tiny tears disappearing before they had the chance to fall properly. I stayed there longer than I should have, standing alone in the wide, open field with a strip of my daughter's quilt and the echo of someone's watchful eyes still clinging to the air. By the time I returned to the porch, I saw movement on the path, a familiar limp, a familiar caution. Daniel! He moved quickly, though each step looked like it hurt. When he reached the yard, he didn't ask what I was holding. Didn't ask why I was standing outside despite the cold. Didn't ask what I'd seen. Instead, his face went pale. So pale I thought for a moment he might collapse right there in the snow. He was here. It wasn't a question, just a quiet, broken statement that made my stomach twist. I nodded. He left this. I held out the cloth. Daniel flinched, as though I'd handed him something burning. He didn't touch it. Where was he standing? His voice was tight, strained at the edges. By the field. Watching. Daniel shut his eyes, his jaw clenching hard. He shouldn't have found you, he whispered. He shouldn't have come this close. A thought rose in me, cold, sharp. Who is he, Daniel? He opened his eyes, and the look in them was not fear but something far heavier, recognition, regret, a memory he had hoped would never breathe again. He's the reason Lily ran, Daniel said, and the reason she stayed hidden. The wind lifted gently, pushing snow across the yard in slow, swirling arcs. I swallowed. My voice barely rose above the breeze. And what reason is that? Daniel's lips parted, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he stepped closer, his breath shaking as he looked toward the tree line where the stranger had disappeared. He was connected to her, Daniel said softly. And to me. Long before either of us deserved her kindness. A chill settled deep in my bones that had nothing to do with winter. What does he want? I whispered. Daniel's answer was barely a breath, thin, frayed, terrifying in its simplicity. Not what? Who? Snow drifted lightly around us, soft as ash. The strip of quilt binding slipped slightly in my hand, its edge brushing my skin like Lily's voice trying to warn me from across the years. And in that quiet, frozen moment I knew, whoever that man was, he wasn't finished. Not with Daniel. Not with Lily. And certainly not with me. Night pushed its way into the house slowly, not with darkness, but with a dull blue hush that made everything feel a little farther away than it should. The lamps cast soft halos across the walls, their glow swallowed at the edges by winter's early shadows. Daniel sat at the far end of the room, hands clasped together, coat still on as though part of him expected to leave again at any moment. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in the way grief can fold a person inward until only the truth keeps them upright. I settled across from him, Lily's quilt draped over my lap, the strip of binding from the stranger resting on the table beside us. The room held its breath. So did I. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, and the look in his eyes told me he had run out of reasons to keep quiet. "It happened 3 winters ago," he began, voice low, as if speaking to the past itself. "The river didn't freeze solid that year. Looked solid, but it wasn't. I knew that winter. Everyone did. A season of thin ice and thick fears." Daniel rubbed at his injured leg, the motion instinctive, pain with a memory behind it. "I tried to cross," he said. "I thought I could make it before the thaw set in for good." He exhaled, a slow, frayed breath that seemed to take something from him. "The ice broke." A pause. "I went under." The house seemed to lean closer, as though listening. "I don't remember how long I was in the water," he said. "Long enough to think I wasn't coming back up." His eyes flicked to the quilt, then to the window where snow tap-tapped like fingers trying to be let in. "But she came," he whispered. "Lily." My breath hitched. He nodded as if he'd heard it. "She pulled me out," he said softly. "With her bare hands. With a strength I didn't know she had." I pictured her, my Lily, kneeling at the riverbank, arms plunged into the ice-cold water, fighting for a stranger's life with nothing but sheer will. A shiver traveled down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "When she dragged me to the shore," Daniel continued, "I thought I was seeing an angel." He gave a small, humorless smile. "She didn't like when I said that. She told me I was stubborn, reckless, and heavy as hell." For a moment, a tiny flicker of warmth crossed his face. Memory can be cruel that way, how it offers comfort and pain in the same breath. His expression shifted then, the warmth draining out like water through broken boards. "He was there too," Daniel said quietly. "The one who waits." The room tightened around his words, the air colder, the shadows deeper. I felt my fingers curl into the quilt. "He came out of the woods," Daniel said. "Stood over us while I was coughing up river water." His voice lowered. "Didn't offer help. Didn't move. Just watched." A tremor ran through his hands, so slight that I might have missed it if the lamplight hadn't caught it. "When Lily reached for me," he said, "when she put her hands on me, that's when his face changed." "What did he want?" I whispered. Daniel swallowed. "Not me." A difficult pause. "Her." My breath thinned. The house fell silent except for the faint ticking of heat pipes working harder than usual. "Why blame her?" I asked. "What happened between them?" Daniel stared at the floor, lips pressed tight, as if the truth itself was too heavy to lift with words. "It wasn't something she did," he said. "It was something she knew." The lamp flickered. The wind hissed outside, skipping loose snow across the path in soft, scraping lines. "He said she had seen something," Daniel murmured. "Something from long before she ever found me in the river." A coldness spread through my chest, slow and creeping. What had she seen? He finally looked at me, really looked, with eyes full of a sorrow I wasn't prepared to bear. "The winter truth," he said. Her words, not mine. The phrase hit the room like a quiet blow. Lily had written it, whispered it, sewn it into her letters and stitched it beneath her quilt. And now it stood between us like something living. "After she saved me," Daniel said, "she didn't go home." I closed my eyes against the ache building behind them. "She said she needed time," he continued. "That the man wouldn't stop watching her until she figured out what it was she'd seen." He rubbed the space above his brow, a gesture of someone haunted by hours he couldn't change. "She hid because of him," he said. "Not because of me. Not because of you." His voice fractured on the last word. "She didn't want him anywhere near you. That's why she stayed on the far side of the river. Why she built signs you'd recognize only if you looked closely, the threads, the scraps, the notes." My heart hurt, physically hurt, like someone had reached in and twisted it. He leaned back, exhausted by the truth he had finally let unravel. "She told me once," he said, "that the river remembers everything people try to bury in it." A pause. A long, fragile breath. She believed the river still held the key to what she saw, and to what she feared the man would do if she didn't stay between you and him. My throat tightened until speaking felt impossible. "So she protected me," I managed, "by disappearing." Daniel nodded, slow and heavy. "She saved my life," he whispered. "And she tried to save yours." The fire cracked, sending a spark skittering across the hearth. I stared at the quilt, at the stars she had sewn, the messages she had hidden, the path she'd marked without ever stepping back inside the door she once opened with laughter. Outside, snow tapped the window softly, a pattern, a rhythm, as if inviting me to listen closer. I realized, in a low and sinking way, that Lily had been fighting a storm I hadn't seen forming. And winter had always known more than I did. I touched the faded note in my pocket. Whatever the winter truth was, it hadn't finished unfolding. And the river, cold, restless, and waiting, still held a piece of her story beneath its shifting ice. The river always looked different in winter, quieter than it should be, as though holding its breath beneath the ice. That morning, the sky was the color of faded pewter, a dull light spreading across the frozen fields and making everything shine in a way that didn't feel warm at all. I wrapped Lily's quilt around my shoulders before stepping outside. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and unforgiving, but the quilt held its warmth, as if her hands still lingered in every stitched violet. The cold carried silence with it, a silence that wasn't empty but full, full of the things I had yet to hear, yet to understand. And so I walked toward the river, letting the quilt trail slightly behind me like a piece of her following my steps. When I reached the path, snow settled in soft layers over the footprints that once marked Daniel's way. Only faint impressions remained now, shadows of steps instead of the steps themselves. The woods leaned inward, branches brushing one another with soft sighs of frost. I moved slowly, boots crunching in the thin snow, each press of my heel met with the hollow echo of frozen ground. The river greeted me with a long, low groan, the ice shifting under its own weight. The sound wasn't threatening, just honest. A winter truth of its own. I stepped closer, feeling the cold rise from the surface like the breath of something ancient. The quilt shifted around my shoulders, the corner brushing my arm, a gentle reminder of the warmth I had once taken for granted. Near the bend where the reeds grew tallest, a strange shape broke the smooth white of the snow. A small hollow, perfectly round, as if the ice itself had exhaled and left a mark. I crouched down carefully, brushing away the top layer of frost. There, half buried in the hollow, sealed in dark wax, was a letter. My breath caught. No wind moved. Not a single branch shook. Only the sound of the river shifting underneath as though recognizing what I had found. The envelope was cold, colder than the snow around it. My fingers stung when they touched the wax, but I lifted it gently and held it close, feeling the weight in my hands. It was hers. I knew before I saw the handwriting. Lily had left me one final message. I carried the letter back to a fallen log near the tree line. The quilt slid into my lap as I settled onto the cold wood, the fabric cradling the letter like it knew what it held. With numb fingers, I cracked the wax. It broke like thin ice. Inside was a single sheet, ink faded but readable, edges stiff from the cold. I forced my breath to steady and read. Mama, if you're reading this, the river has allowed it. I thought I could outrun winter, but sometimes winter isn't a season. Sometimes it's the truth itself. My eyes blurred, but I blinked the sting away and continued. You would ask if you did something wrong. You didn't. You were the only thing that felt right. But I knew if I stayed, you'd follow me into something you should never see. The wind picked up, lifting the edge of the letter like Lily herself guiding my hand. I wasn't protecting myself. I was protecting you. I had to become the winter so you didn't freeze in it. A low sound escaped my throat, half grief, half love, the kind that sits too deep to be spoken aloud. A soft crunch sounded behind me. Not the shifting of snow in the wind, but footsteps. Slow. Measured. The hair on my arms rose beneath the quilt. I didn't turn immediately. I kept my eyes on the letter, letting its final lines root themselves into the deepest part of me. If you follow my steps, do so only when the ice sings. The river will tell you when the truth is ready, not before. The footsteps grew closer, careful, deliberate. I folded the letter slowly, slipping it into the quilt's inner fold as though placing it back into her hands. Then, only then, did I turn. The figure stood on the edge of the river, not on the bank, but on the ice itself. The same long coat, the same rigid shoulders, the same unnatural stillness I'd seen at the field's edge. And again, no breath fogged the air before him. His head tilted slightly, as though studying what I held. As though disappointed I had found it. The ice beneath his boots groaned again, but he didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight, didn't acknowledge the danger the way any living person would. A shadow passed over his face as he took one more step toward me, a slow glide rather than a walk. My pulse pounded so loudly I barely heard the soft crack of a branch behind me. Daniel emerged from the woods a moment later, limping more heavily than I'd ever seen, cheeks flushed with cold and fear. He saw the man on the ice and froze. All the way back here, he whispered. He shouldn't be near you. The man didn't look Daniel's way, didn't acknowledge him at all. His eyes were fixed on me, and what I held. Stay behind me, Daniel said quietly, moving to take a step forward. But the man on the ice lifted a hand, palm open, fingers long and rigid, and the air between us seemed to thicken. Not with sound, not with cold, but with remembering. The river beneath him let out a long, deep groan, the kind that felt like a warning from something very old and very tired. Daniel's breath hitched. He knows you read it, he said. He knows what she feared. Snow swirled around us, the flakes catching on the quilt, on my hair, on the letter tucked beneath the fabric. The man took one more slow step forward. The ice held. Silent now. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low and urgent. We have to go, he murmured. You've found what she left. But the river isn't done yet. I looked at the figure one last time, unmoving, breathless, waiting. Then I turned away, the quilt tight around me, Lily's final words pulsing against my heart. Behind us, the ice groaned one last time, as though acknowledging that the truth had finally been found, but not yet understood. The first light of dawn drifted over the horizon like a slow exhale, soft and golden, touching the edges of the quilt wrapped around my shoulders until the violets stitched into it seemed to glow from within. The house behind me was still, holding the quiet of a night that had not truly ended. The river in front of me murmured beneath its crust of ice, low and uncertain, as though deciding whether it would hold or finally give way. The world felt caught in that brief, trembling moment between freeze and thaw, between what I knew and what waited just beyond it. I took one step closer to the riverbank, the quilt brushing my ankles, the letter tucked inside pressing softly against my chest. The ink of Lily's handwriting felt warm through the fabric, as if her words were waking too. Across the river, a lone figure emerged through the lifting fog. Daniel! His limp made his silhouette sway gently, but he moved with urgency, waving both arms to catch my attention. Margaret! His voice carried unevenly, the river swallowing half the sound, but enough made its way to me. Come back, before the ice breaks. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the tree line, toward the place where the other man had watched me the night before. The light caught the frost in Daniel's hair, turning him almost spectral, as though he belonged to the morning more than the world I stood in. I looked down at the ice, white veins spreading beneath the surface, thin cracks forming quiet spiderwebs near the bend. It was breaking. Slowly, but undeniably. I held the quilt tighter, touching the letter through the fabric with the tips of my fingers. Lily's final words pressed back into my palm like a heartbeat. The river gave a long, low groan, a sound that echoed in my ribs. I stepped away from the bank. Daniel met me halfway across the snowy clearing, breathing hard, one hand braced on a tree for balance. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said. His voice was soft, not scolding, just tired. Tired in the way someone gets when they've been afraid too long. I opened my mouth to answer, but the quilt shifted, and the letter slipped slightly from its fold. Daniel's eyes flicked to it. What did she say? I held the letter close to my chest, not out of secrecy, but because the question hurt in a way I wasn't ready to show. Not everything yet, I said quietly. The last line. I haven't read it aloud. Daniel nodded once. He didn't push. He just looked at the ground, as though the snow there might tell him what words could not. A cold wind swept across the clearing, lifting a small swirl of snow, and with it, the faintest shift of movement near the dark line of trees. The man. The one who didn't leave fog when he breathed. If he breathed at all. He stood just beyond the branches, hands at his sides, coat unmoving even as the wind pressed against the fabric. His presence felt like the pull of deep winter, quiet, heavy, waiting. But he didn't step forward. Not this time. Daniel saw him too. The fear in his eyes settled into something else now, something steadier. Resolved. We should go, he murmured. He can't cross in daylight. I didn't ask why. Some truths didn't need the shape of words to be understood. Back at the house, warmth welcomed us in the soft crackle of the stove and the familiar smell of pine stored in the walls. I draped the quilt across the table, letting the morning sun fall over it until the patterns seemed to breathe again. Daniel stayed near the door, leaning on the frame, as though unsure whether he belonged inside. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter completely for the first time. The last line waited at the bottom in the smallest handwriting, as if Lily had written it in the dark, or with a shaking hand, or both. I traced the faded ink before I spoke it aloud. The words were soft, almost fragile. When winter is done, I'll find my way home. The sentence lingered in the air, hovering between us with a strange, painful hope. Daniel closed his eyes, a slow release of breath leaving him as though he'd been holding it for 3 long winters. She meant it, he whispered. She always meant her promises. I folded the letter gently, sliding it back into the quilt where it belonged, where she had wanted it kept. Outside, the morning brightened, snow shifting from blue to white as the sun climbed. The thaw had begun. Then, just as Daniel stepped forward to speak again, a sound cut through the quiet. A knock. Soft. Gentle. A knock I had heard every morning for nearly 20 years before Lily disappeared. My breath stilled. Daniel's hand froze in the air. The knock came again, 3 slow taps, each one familiar in a way that made my knees weaken. It was the knock she used when she came home late from the barn as a girl, trying not to wake me. The knock she used when she returned from long walks in summer storms, hair dripping, boots muddy, smiling like she already knew the scolding would turn into laughter. The knock she used on the night she left for the last time. I took one step toward the door. The floor creaked softly beneath me, a sound like the house remembering her weight. Daniel didn't move to stop me. He only whispered, almost to himself, "Not memory. Not with the thaw." My fingers hovered above the latch, the quilt still warm around my shoulders, Lily's letter pressing gently against my heart. Sunlight pooled across the floor, creeping toward the threshold like an invitation. The knock sounded once more, quiet, steady, waiting. I drew a breath, slow and trembling, and then I opened the door.